John Perkins, who wrote The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I mean, we've done a lot of really interesting characters over this past year, because that's how old the show is.
John is a great guy. We've had him on several times, and we did a great interview with him about his time in the Amazon and about psychedelics and ayahuasca, which was it took us by surprise, because, he's known for the economic hitman stuff, but if you ever get into those topics with him, he's very, very well knowledgeable in those.
Yeah, there are a few people. In fact, we had Amber Lyon on, who was the CNN journalist who ended up quitting famously because of the censorship she experienced at CNN, and she's also very much into the psychedelics now. And this is an old story as far as how they can potentially be healing, on a cultural level, on a spiritual level. So that's always fun to talk to people about their experiences with things like ayahuasca, DMT.
Yes, absolutely. We've had Joe Rogan on, we've had Rick Strassman, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked about that in great depth, and I think that's really what the world needs at this point in time, because from my personal experiences, when I take ayahuasca, I take a step back and remember and go, wait a minute, there's much more to this world than all this physical stuff. And of course, martial law is a big deal, and everything that's going on with these World War III or the planning of World War III, et cetera, et cetera. But if we all had that sense of higher consciousness and took a big step back, I think the whole world would change on its own.
Well, the world is constantly changing on its own. I think the problem sometimes people get into is when they try to predict what's coming, as opposed to simply dealing with themselves and their own spiritual issues, because you have to, just like we as individuals have to go through certain darkness in order to see the light, in order to you have to go through the dark night of the soul, as they say in the Bible. Mm-hmm. You have to go through crisis and chaos and trauma to wake yourself up. And so I think as a planet, we are going through those dark moments of despair, pessimism, death, things that are meant to ultimately be transformative towards ideally, a new awakening. And so from my experience, I didn't really delve too much into the hallucinogens. I just delved into like haunted places, like mental hospitals and haunted houses, where there was all kinds of paranormal activity that we were experiencing that was linked to, a very demonic world. So I'm not exactly someone who's a big proponent of random drug use. I think drugs oftentimes are gateways that, if you're not doing it under the right parameters, with almost an initiation. If you look at the history of drug use, it's always been done, through instruction with a teacher, someone who's helping guide your path. Otherwise, you'll get lost in a spiritual torture, as many people who use drugs casually, recreationally now are finding themselves in.
You're absolutely right, and we've talked about that in great depth. And I would disagree with people like Dennis McKenna and others who say that there's benefits to LSD and ecstasy and things like that. I think those were synthesized versions to give people the illusion that they're experiencing some kind of spirituality. They're doing it without the shaman, of course, and it's coming in place, and it's an imitation of ayahuasca, magic mushrooms, and sacred ceremonies, which should be used with a purpose.
Correct, and that's the whole issue, is that, again, these guys tap into an esoteric tradition of drug use. They see the mushroom, for example, the priest cap with the mushroom, for example, and they say that the mushroom is magical and sacred, which it is, but that means it has to be taken under the proper conditions. So you have to be in the right frame of mind to know what you're doing and have the right intention going into it, as opposed to, hey, let's just eat mushrooms and, consider ourselves open-minded and radical. And you're inviting in a lot of entities that are negative that will stick around. They will stay.
Let me ask you this. I didn't plan to ask you about this, but since we're on the topic, I came across an article that you converted to Islam. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
I mean, it's an old story. What aspect do you want to get into? I've talked on this in a lot of different angles, but, be more specific.
Well, there's a lot of negative press about Islam, and on our show, we try to present everything from a 360-degree angle and see all perspectives. I personally like to take a step back from all religions and just go straight to spirituality. I don't like to be into any confounds, but what was the reasons that you converted to Islam, and what are the positive aspects of it that we can counteract the negative press and the negative propaganda against it?
I think the positive aspect is, you can study the religion for yourself. You can read the Quran, you can look at the direct writings and decide for yourself. Just like any religion that gets, a bad rap, it's like people get caught up in their perception of it, right? There are a lot of Christians who hate Catholics, and a lot of Catholics who are obviously believe that the Pope is the scion of God on earth. I mean, there's Jews who don't even understand their own religion and fight internally. It's every religion has its issues. You can look at Islam right now and say, look at these idiots in Sudan who are trying to condemn a woman for being a Christian. I mean, it's just like there's insanity. There's insanity in people all around. I look at the actual writings and the spiritual principles of the religion, and Islam is very clear in that it's a tradition that, if you read the Quran, mostly talks about the Old Testament prophets, mostly talks about Jesus Christ, who's considered the Messiah in Islam. He's returning. And all these, so basically Islam is a continuation of the Judeo-Christian culture, with Muhammad as being the final prophet in that lineage going back to Abraham. So it's not like in a sense, when I accept Islam, it's very simple to me, because it's a merging of the three religions, but always with the sense that there's no priest that is an intermediary between you and God. It's much more of a direct prayer. Your prayers are directly to God. Your practice is supposed to be about your relationship to God, not being dictated to by a higher authority. And so, obviously, again, there's always issues with every religion now, and I think it's just a question of how you want to how you understand God, really.
Very well said. Quick break, ladies and gentlemen. And on that note, I've always seen Islamic terrorists, or Islamic extremists, I should say, like the Westboro Baptist Church. It's not indicative of everybody. And that's what we have to realize. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be divided. We'll be right back. All right, we are back speaking with Sean Stone, the host of Buzzsaw, and we were on the topic of religion just a moment ago, and psychedelics as well, which is really great, because I was planning to talk about martial law and other physical things that are going on right now. But Sean, let's stick on spirituality here for a few moments. Have you found, well, first of all, let me ask you this, and if you don't mind talking about this publicly, have you had experiences with ayahuasca and psychedelics, and if so, do you find that conflicts with anything in Islam? You don't have to answer that if you don't like to. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had experience with ayahuasca and mushrooms, and Islam is much more critical when it comes to alcohol and drug abuse. The idea of fermented drugs,
right?
And I think validly so. If you look at the alcoholic culture that we're in right now, the party culture, where people down way too much alcohol, it's clearly unhealthy. It's a poison. If it wasn't a poison, then you wouldn't be puking it up if you drank too much, right? So we have a tendency towards alcoholism, and obviously the main point of Islam on these topics is emphasizing personal responsibility. Right, people lose their self-control. Girls go and hook up with a guy and they say, "Oh, I was drunk," so I couldn't control myself. A guy gets drunk and gets in a fight. It's like, "Oh, I was drunk," and that's when people lose that sense of responsibility. So when it comes to hallucinogens, you're not losing a sense of responsibility, because you're literally going into a different state of mind to learn. Ayahuasca, you're not harming anybody. You're literally in a comatose state for 6 hours, and traveling in your mind or astrally or wherever you're going, you're leaving this dimension. And so I think that it doesn't abdicate that sense of a personal responsibility, which is what's being emphasized. As far as the dangers to it, again, alcohol is poisonous. It's a toxin. If ayahuasca is proved to be toxic or dangerous to your health, then I understand why it would be prohibited. But again, this has more to do with the idea of people looking after themselves and and respecting their bodies and living healthy lives. Which is the emphasis. Was supposed to be the basis of these religions.
Very well said, and I completely agree with that. Alcohol, I don't drink alcohol at all. It's just the spirits do not agree with me, and they're called spirits, rightfully so.
Well, and even in the Old Testament, they were very clear about drunkenness versus drinking a glass of wine, and the fact that when somebody gets drunk on a regular basis, they have no real spirituality and they have no real connection to God.
Right, exactly. And again, spirits are involved, yes. And I just did an interview on Buzzsaw with Hazel Courtenay, who's a journalist. She's been a journalist for 20, 30 years, and she had her own awakening to an out-of-body near-death experience, and she started studying the science of these things. And she talks about the cameras that are kind of like Carillion photography, where they can see the entities that are attached to people. You see their chakras are blown open from alcohol abuse, and you can see where there are things, literally entities that are not in our visible spectrum, that have attached themselves to our being. And so whether or not we understand it, there's a reason why people of religious nature would say don't expose yourself to that.
Have you ever seen a film, or maybe even heard of a filmmaker, Christopher Everard? He made a film called Spirit World, I believe, is where he talks about these mojos. And there's a tradition that believes that these are disembodied spirits, and they hang around doors and other places like that, and they can enter the body and cling onto it. And he even went so far as to say that he believes that like teratoma tumors are a result of these mojos inside of people that are actually trying to create a body of their own, and that's why they create teeth and eyes and all kinds of just weird stuff inside of the body. But it's a very, very fascinating film if you've never seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I like Chris Everard's work. He's doing honest stuff, which is to say, you've got to look at this spiritual aspect of power and the relationship of people in power to occultism, to Satanism, to and magic. Not all magic is black, and not all magic is meant to hurt people. But if we don't address this and look at this honestly, then I think we're putting a bag over our heads and saying everything's fine. This is the Matrix, and I just want to enjoy the meat and not have to consider the ramifications, repercussions of my actions.
You must unite what is inside us.
We are TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.